Good evening. Welcome to the 2015 Kinoshita Lecture by Professor Jacques Herzog from Pritzker Prize-winning architects Herzog and de Meuron. My name is Allison Cheng, alumna of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, we are greatly honored to have invited Professor Herzog to deliver his lecture at our university campus. First of all, may I invite Professor Nelson Chen, Director of the School of Architecture, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Professor Chen, please.
Dean Chiu, honored guests, faculty colleagues, and students of the School of Architecture. A very warm welcome to you all this evening on the occasion of the 2015 Kinoshita Lecture in Architecture. We've had an overwhelming public response to the extent that we will be standing room only here, as well as live streaming to the second lecture hall next door. So greetings to all of our guests in both venues. On behalf of the Chinese University of Hong Kong and our School of Architecture, we are especially grateful and privileged for the special opportunity to hear from Jacques Herzog of Herzog and de Meuron, the Pritzker Prize and RIBA gold medal winning architects whose internationally acclaimed design work is known to many of us in this audience. In addition, we are pleased to welcome both of the founding partners, Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, together with a number of their partners, associates, and staff. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to acknowledge a longtime friend and supporter to our school, as well as to me personally, Mr. James Kinoshita, honorary architect of CUHK, whose continuing generosity makes possible this lecture series that features world-renowned distinguished architects to come to our university and to share their insights and experience with our students, as well as the architectural community. Jim, may I ask you to stand so we may all show our appreciation. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker and the architectural practice of Herzog and de Meuron. Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron were born in the same year, within just a few blocks of each other in Basel, Switzerland. They have known each other since kindergarten. Both of them received their architectural education at the ETH in Zurich, and both were assistants to Professor Dolf Schnebly before forming their partnership in 1978. They are also professors at ETH Studios in Basel, Contemporary City Institute, which they co-founded, as well as visiting professors at Harvard Graduate School of Design in 1989 and since 1994 to the present. Professionally, the HDM practice has grown to be an office with well over 400 collaborators worldwide, still headquartered in Basel, with branch offices in Hamburg, London, Madrid, New York, and here in Hong Kong, while working on projects throughout Europe, North and South America, and Asia. For me to recite a list of their most significant projects, design awards, and professional accomplishments would be another lecture in itself. I will not attempt that. Besides, you all have Google. But instead, allow me to introduce our speaker and his practice from a slightly different perspective to pinpoint their unique position in our field and profession of architecture. To me, what is the most remarkable about the work of Herzog and de Meuron, ongoing for well over 35 years now, is how it remains continually inquisitive and inventive. Thus, their work is not predictable and always challenges conventional thinking. If one mentions the names of other famous and successful architects of our time, say Tadao Ando, Richard Meyer, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, all Pritzker Prize winners, many of us in this room would be able to identify their designs from, say, a published image without the benefit of knowing the location or the building type. They have their signature styles and have become recognized accordingly. Not so with Jacques Herzog, Pierre de Meuron, and their partners. Their work transcends any categories or typecasting. There is never a preconceived solution or so-called signature style that identifies the architect first before the project itself. Instead, there is a continuing search and faithful commitment through both research and design methodology to discover or to invent with materials and techniques to inform their design outcomes with a unique architectural vision. Or, as Rafael Moneo, yet another Pritzker laureate, has commented, quote, "They are among the very few architects whose work can be interpreted as an effort to regain architecture's original grounds, a search for primariness, for direct contact with the constructive essence of architecture, characterizes their work and differentiates it from that of others of their generation with whom they diverge in their emphasis on originality," end quote. This commitment was evident from their earliest built work, such as the Ricola storage building in Laufen, the train station signal box in Basel, the Dominus winery in Napa, California, soon to be followed by major international commissions for the Tate Modern in London, both the original conversion of the Bankside Power Station and its currently planned extension, also the National Stadium, aka Bird's Nest for the Beijing Olympics, and of course, two major projects ongoing in Hong Kong for the M+ Museum and Central Police Station revitalization. Now, I know I just promised not to list all their significant work, and I've not lied. These are just a few of my personal favorites. Allow me to mention just two more. The Caixa Forum, another museum integrated with an abandoned power station, this time in Madrid. The project architect for HDM was our very own Professor Peter Ferreira. And 1111 Lincoln Road, a multi-use development that features a 300-car park structure that literally turns the mundane building type on its head into a work of art, comprising an exposed structure of floating floor plates, angle columns, and no apparent facades. It's amazing to see and experience in real life, as I did in Miami 5 years ago. Frank Lloyd Wright was often asked the question, "What is your favorite building among all your work?" And his answer was always, "The next one." I believe that our distinguished speaker tonight might answer the same question the same way. It's truly with great personal pleasure and professional admiration that I introduce to you this evening Professor Jacques Herzog.
Thank you very much for welcoming us here in Hong Kong. It's not the first lecture that I give, as you may know, and for this reason, it's always difficult to put together something that you as a speaker you would like to talk about, and you as a speaker also think should be communicated in a given place. So this lecture is made for you, for this public, for this city. Today I may slightly disappoint you because you mentioned many projects, indeed important ones to us, and but I focus on art. Being with art means that, in fact, since our early days, it was mentioned that we know each other since kindergarten, but maybe not since those days, but since our teenage years, we were rather surrounded by art or artist friends than architecture. We made a decision to go into architecture relatively late, not knowing really what that is, that kind of field. Being with art is also out of which I think we were able to develop museums or places where humans and artworks come together in a way that found the acceptance of artists, and for that reason then also from clients, from museum directors. That's what we will do today. I will start with one project, which is the Tate, and then go back to the very beginning of our career. But as I said, I will focus only on a few museums, and I will not present many other museums which are as important or as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than the ones that I present. But those that I present make sense in this particular context. So I, for instance, don't show the De Young or the Kaiser Forum or the Parish or quite a few others, the Walker, for instance. But I start with the Tate because it was in January 1995, which is exactly 20 years ago, that we were called by Nicholas Sirota, the director of the Tate, who told us that we were the winners of the competition to design and build Tate Modern in London. That competition had started in '94 and was among the then most prominent figures in the field, and we were not only the youngest ones but also outsiders somehow. But as what I said before, that the art world knew that we were doing a different kind of art galleries and we had a different approach, and that was the reason why we were commissioned by the Tate. And to celebrate this moment, in order to celebrate this moment, I decided to start with the Tate, because the Tate is indeed somehow like the mother of all our projects, not only architectural ones, but also even beyond, because it involves so many things that are important to us and that you somehow find in a different form, maybe in other projects. It has to do with urban issues. It has to do with, for instance, wherever you put a building, what is the rest of the city? What can you do with the given program to make the building more than just a piece of architecture? What can you do to make it a public space? What can you do? How can you convert a building? How can you interfere in a building? How can you reconstruct? How can you simulate? How can you do galleries? How can you add to a building, etc., etc.? So like concepts, it was said in the introduction that we don't have a style or that we don't build on recognizable forms. That's very true, and I think the Tate is a very good example. This first ugly image here shows how the whole area looks now. It was found in Google. The towers at the right-hand side and the bridge on the left-hand side show how much this project, not only through our intervention, but through the fact that it was invented as a project by Nicholas Sirota, that he found this building, totally transformed this part of London. 20 years ago, that was a sad, kind of forgotten place, a part of a city that nobody actually knew, even if it was right across from St. Paul's Cathedral, till today, the most important and most beautiful building in London. So this chimney was put right across from the Thames in order to establish a connection between these two buildings. But as you can see here, that's the pre-intervention kind of area. This is an industrial, abandoned or half-abandoned place and hardly developed. And the power station was like a castle that was very energetic, but at the same time very hermetic. So to bring a gallery which will be the most visited art museum of contemporary art in the world, with more than 5 million people every year, double as many as MoMA in New York, was kind of strange and paradox, because you had to do what this building didn't want to be. You had to make it public. Today the building is connected with the other side of the Thames and is surrounded by a forest of high-rise and more or less ugly developer architecture. Before, when we came in, it was a cathedral for energy. And this kind of cathedral aspect is what we were impressed by, and now we come to how to deal with an existing building. That we discovered this turbine hall, those are the turbines here, into really the public space, new public space in London that would become important and popular far beyond its role as a place in a museum, but as a meeting place for people. What we've done is we dug it out, so we make it deeper and higher, so we make it more what it was before. We enforce it, and that's also a strategy in our work, that instead of working against something, like in a kind of an Asian battle concept, like in a Tai Chi manner, we try to enhance the forces or the hidden forces or energies or potentials of a place to make it, to win it or gain it for the building. And so the turbine hall became really a cathedral-like space for people to meet, but also for artists to develop installations, like here at the opening, that's a drop sculpture by Louise Bourgeois, but since then it has been many times used by many artists to develop things. That's a kind of a niche or a lounge which is compressing the space so that people don't always feel in awe staying in this overly large turbine hall. Here is an intervention by Anish Kapoor, which couldn't have been done anywhere else than in that space. So this space is a huge challenge for the artists, but it's also an opportunity to give London once a year a special presentation, a special kind of experience that before no museum in the world has done or could do. In similar way, I think M+ can become an important museum. We come back to that certainly later. Hong Kong is not an art city, as you know, but it might be one in the future, and the project hopefully contributes to make art, what we've always found about it, a very important ingredient of everybody's life, because it's inspiring. It has no function. It's useless. But it's inspiring in that it tells you more about your own perceptions. You see things that otherwise you wouldn't see. This is Olafur Eliasson's Sun project. That's another project in the turbine hall using the ramp, a sculpture. And of course, in that existing building, we had to build in galleries, as opposed to the extension project, which is on the way now. We will see some images later, where the galleries are also new, also in a kind of preconceived geometry, but not really using existing architectural elements. This one here had to accept structural conditions, but we were free to introduce daylight, artificial light, the way that we have been testing it in the previous years before we were commissioned to do Tate. And for instance here, this kind of skylight from the side that is very remindful of Goethe's gallery. Or this double height space with this famous Beuys installation. But also, as I said before, the Tate is so huge that we had to introduce niches and places for people to come together, to breathe, to have a view over the city. It's like a little city. It's certainly also this lesson that we had to learn, and we learned with Tate. That's why this project, I call this project the mother of all the projects, because it opened up doors for us that otherwise would never have been opened. This beam, this light beam on the top that we introduce as in juxtaposition to the vertical one, the given one. The public space in front, not the only one. We saw the turbine hall, we saw the ramp. These all became meeting placing for Londoners. This is a section through the Tate Modern that you know, with the ramp in the middle and the turbine hall here. And that all was unexploited potential in the first phase. The underground with the tanks and the switch house, this is currently being transferred or transformed into galleries, and the tanks had been opened to the public 2 years ago. And above this ground, out of this ground, we grow the expansion project for Tate Modern. I refuse to call it Tate 2 because it's going to be one organism. But you can see in the floor plan, this is the turbine hall, this is the former boiler house, and that all, this big potential, was not exploited and is currently under construction. On this image, you can see how powerful this underground space is. That's another obsession that, you know, follows like a red line through quite a few of our projects, that we want to dig out, to use everything, and not only use it as a space, but also use it as an inspiration. In this case, this rough underworld, which adds to the museum a very important ingredient that it didn't have, because it has mainly refined gallery space, and these oil tanks offer an opportunity for laboratory kind of spaces. That also is something that in an altered manner you will find again in M+. Here the concrete was old, was given, we could drill into it and leave traces, we could use surfaces. It has the encounter of old concrete that we found and new concrete, old new structure and old structure, and very different kind of public space. If you imagine this all to be integrated in this kind of organism that Tate Modern will be in 2 years from now, when the building will be opened. This particular part has already been shown to the public 2 years ago, and gallery spaces have been installed in one of the tanks in a kind of a performing space, and the other in a kind of more gallery space in a more classical way, that it has art on the walls or projection on the walls. The fact that performing arts has been introduced is, of course, a newer trend in museums, but is especially important also here in Hong Kong, where there is a lively scene for this. But performing arts to be integrated in museums or places for visual culture is absolutely mandatory, to respect also the wide field of artist intervention. Video galleries, galleries which are awkward or strange, but on the other hand offer opportunities for artists to express themselves or to find site-specific interventions, like here. In the section, again, now the other way around, the existing boiler house and the turbine hall and the underground connection over to the excavated tank area, and from there the way up in this kind of pyramidal shaped tower, which is not only increasing space but also adding spaces for education, for members, for schools, Tate Exchange, many spaces that Tate doesn't have at the moment. So, and also in the way it's structured, this being more a classical enfilade type of gallery arrangement, whereas these are rougher in the lower part and taller, loft-like in the upper floors. And you will see that the walk through the building and the connection over this bridge between this this 3 gallery floors on that side and 3 gallery floors on that side. There is one bridge connecting through Turbine Hall, one way connecting from the south, which is new, this plaza, over the bridge to the north sides with the Thames. And, of course, on the tank level into the floor of the Turbine Hall. On the plan, you see these new galleries and the old galleries and the scale comparison and all these spaces wrapping around the central cores, which are social public spaces. The one floor 5, which connects over to the gallery floor on this side, and these huge exhibition spaces, which are offering very generous conditions, different heights, different floor materials, beam structures, different ceilings, for different conditions and different types of art. So I think that's very important, that the museum is not just bigger, but offers different conditions for curators and artists. That also is certainly something from, where we could learn from and do this and introduce this again in altered way in other museums, such as Miami or PAM or Paris or M+, of course. The structure has a very strange shape. This is almost as it looks now, and it's going to be clad with brick. But I showed this image so you understand the form is not the result of a mood or a formal exaltation, but is somehow a rational idea of the given floor, the kind of given conditions on the sidewalk, on the street level, and the kind of ratio that we respect on the top, where we go back to the orthogonality of the given building. So together it makes for this pyramidal shape. And this pyramidal shape, again, has to respect and has to fulfill all these things. It's, of course, an envelope we have to deal with. It's the program that has to be filled in, and has to be filled in a way that the voids that are resulting from these fill-ins are attractive. The voids are leading the people through the building in a kind of a vertical boulevard, which is new, as opposed to the more horizontal distribution you experience now in the given structure. Then the structure that grows out, as we saw, from this concrete world, so the concrete structure and the concrete structure that you will continue to see inside is grows out of the concrete tanks that are so powerful and that you see as a visitor each time you go through. That's the connection on the street level over the bridge. That's the new plaza outside and through the Turbine Hall to the north side. And those are different studies of this vertical circulation, this vertical boulevard, which is very important, that it is not just a circulation, but it's a space to hang out. It's wide, it's pleasant, it's inviting. I'm sure it will be very attractive because each floor is connected in a different way and offers opportunities for people to meet and to relax, to sit on benches, to have views into the museum, but also onto the city. That's the structure, the concrete structure that goes through the whole building and which is clad with bricks. Bricks which are partly perforated, as you will see, and try to be as close to the given brick of the given building as possible. It was not always like this. We had earlier schemes where we did a glass building and we did all kinds of other things that turned out to be stupid. And especially when you see these horrible buildings on the side, all these banks and all these glass buildings, you don't want to be like that. You want to see this as part of one organism, of one thing that belongs together. And that's why the brick, even if it was such an obvious choice, that we were almost in a blind way not immediately going for it, it has a very rich texture. It has a very beautiful surface. And we wanted to take this into a contemporary way. So we wanted to offer the same material. We wanted to offer texture and changing surfaces. We wanted to offer transparencies, but at the same time, opaqueness. We want to work with paradoxes because those are what make architecture sometimes very rich and surprising and inviting and pleasant. Like here in a kind of a conceptual study, where you not only will see out, but you also feel the light inside the building. And I show, because we are at the school here, some of the plans. We always understand architecture as a very craftsmanship-based discipline. And we have to fight for this because normally the architect does a design and has to sign it, so it's this or that famous name. But we insist in translating the designs into the buildings, into spaces, into real spaces, and not just wallpaper on top of a design. So this is hardcore construction, as you can see, and we had to study this very carefully so it works and it doesn't fall apart next to the existing structure, because old buildings, unfortunately, tend to look better than new ones. So we have to be sure to be able to compete, not for the sake of competing, but for the sake of making both parts of the building equally acceptable and equally pleasant. It's very complicated to do a brick wall today, obviously, but you can see that the heavy loads going all the way up this tall facade makes it something where serious construction details are mandatory to cope with loads and movement joints, etc. Once it's finished, the building will offer a new plaza, a pleasant one, because this is south exposed, so it will have sun, and you know the Londoners, they like to go out if the sun is out. And once this is open, the building will also permeable, which means that south and north will be connecting. And at night, it will have a sun transparency through this perforated brick work. I think you can understand, and maybe we come back later, that the Tate was interesting even if it's not the most flashy or, let's say, fashionable, trendy project, if you think of the Miami garage that was mentioned before, which is so cool today. This, we were there last week to celebrate these 20 years, continues to be very powerful and attractive for these people. And also, something I forgot to say, the curators and the directors, they expected 2 million and a bit more. And in fact, they are at a number of 5 million per year, which might increase even a bit more with the new building. So the building has to be robust and has to really deal with all these issues of public space. Now we go back to the very beginning. We move out of this project, and what these lines say is, I think, very important, that when we were young, we were, of course, very inspired that people at that time we found very cool and important and inspiring. And in our case, it was especially artists and not architects. And it was especially three who stood for what we found new and which turned out also to be decisive movements which continue to inspire us till today. That was at the end of the 60s, early 70s, when we were finishing school and starting to think what we could do. It was Andy Warhol, Donald Judd, and Joseph Beuys. They represented somehow, Warhol the king of pop, even if his importance comes from the fact that somehow he transcends pop culture. Donald Judd, who was perhaps the most knowledgeable and also most intellectual among the minimal artists, the so-called minimal artists, and Beuys, who we got to know later because we assisted him in producing a sculpture in Basel that we initiated. Beuys certainly presents two things, maybe his sense of materiality, which is against the normal understanding of what the material is or what the material can do. So it has a kind of a northern magic infused in his, or spirituality in his understanding of materials, and especially also performance. He stands for performance as an important art form. Coming from Basel and living in Basel, Basel is perhaps one of the most important art cities in the world. And even if it's not a big city compared to Chinese cities, it continues to play this role today, not only because of Art Basel, but because its institutions are absolutely world-class. The Kunstmuseum is among the 5 best museums anywhere in the world. And that was very important, that because this museum exposing artists long before any other museum in Europe, for instance, abstract expressionism was shown here when nobody else was showing it, and they bought it gladly also. Pop, Warhol here in the Kunstmuseum, Beuys, but also minimal art, and this is Carl André or Donald Judd. And the steel boxes, this famous enigmatic sculpture, were very inspiring to us because nobody liked it at that time. And especially architects were far away. No architect was actually interested in art at that time, at that generation. So that was a field where we could go on to and into, and which was in some way also a way for us to find the means of expression in a world that was dominated by movements we didn't like deconstructivism or postmodernism. This is Beuys' action, I Like America and America Likes Me in New York with a coyote, and he's in the same room. And this again in the Art Museum in Basel, Hearth, Feuerstätte on the left-hand side, and Feuerstätte 2, this kind of pile of felt suits and these copper sticks. This is the sculpture that we initiated and assisted Beuys in a carnival cortege. So this was the result of this kind of carnival performance, so to speak, and later was donated to the museum. That's in the Contemporary Art Museum in Basel. So it was shown in different places. It's now a permanent display in the city. But we were also, of course, inspired or animated by people who were more closely to us. We were having interesting teachers, especially 2, one being Lucius Burckhardt, almost forgotten sociologist, who was also from Basel, and who made us familiar with the so-called ordinary and unimportant. He was a co-founder of the Green Movement in Europe, and he's currently being rediscovered because the Biennale in Venice, the Swiss Pavilion, was dedicated him an exhibition together with Price. He was perhaps interesting because he was, of course, polemic. He was a left-wing thinker, like all intellectuals, I have to say, at that time in the late 60s and early 70s in Europe. Literally everybody was trying to overcome bourgeoisie and to introduce new ways of living, new ways of seeing, new ways of perceiving. And that was a very strong intellectual move and also a strong political move, something that is totally absent in the younger generation. I don't say that to complain, it's just a historic fact. Burckhardt was complaining about everything, and he was asking why is planning, who is doing planning. It was very much about democracy and making architecture more democratic, something that is perhaps interesting, but as we know, doesn't always lead to better results. The other one was Aldo Rossi, who also was a communist, and for that reason was kicked out of Italy, of the schools in Italy, and then later was also soon kicked out of Switzerland, but in fact was a very successful architect. He was one of the first superstars in architecture, and he couldn't be more different from Lucius Burckhardt in his southern thinking and in his insisting on the permanence of cities and typologies, that you should not invent new typologies, but a colonnade is a colonnade, a courtyard is a courtyard, and Blockrand, the kind of city blocks that you find in European cities, the Berlin blocks, for instance, those were the ingredients, like a recipe with which you had to build a city. And his book, L'architettura della città, the architecture of the city, was like a Bible for every architect in the world, maybe together with Venturi's complexity and contradiction. The work of Aldo Rossi was a bit eclectic, though, except for the first things, which were very subtle, like this fountain in a school building, which was very poor, had almost a proximity to arte povera, which we found very, very intriguing. This photograph was shockingly beautiful for us. I say that for the young generation, that you understand that every generation has this fascination for something, and I think that's very important. You have that, and you leave it later. You forget it. But you have to, you need it to get started. This is Gallartese by Rossi also, and which was this kind of building for social housing on stilts that I revisited last year or so. You can see me there, and I enjoyed it, but somehow I was also a little bit sad because it doesn't work. It's still not filled with life, but it's like a monument of our own memory. Lastly, in this kind of series of dead people, I would like to mention Remy Zaugg, who is a very, very dear artist friend who passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago. And he was not only a great artist, but he was an artist friend, a lifelong friend, with whom we've done many projects. There were periods where he always was like a third partner. At that time, Pierre and I didn't have other partners. And he was an interesting teacher. At the beginning, he was more teaching us. Later, we were, of course, doing really things together, because he's written seminal books on perception of art, the positioning of artworks, and the construction of museums. He was really an amazing person. In his obsession with perception was new and was beyond. And he made out of this his artwork, his paintings, which often were using texts, but the way the letters were written was like painting, which is hard to see, of course, on this image. This is an image which shows the three of us in one of our visits and trips, and a bit like what we've done many years later with Weiwei and continue to do, is going to see things together and developing things, being together, being with art, being with the city, being with people, being on a place, and out of this observation that you should never replace by watching things in Google. You should always go directly to a place and take the inspiration from there. Because architecture is about the reality of what surrounds us, and not just images that we have in our minds. This is one of his books, where he talks about, the title says, the place of the work and of the human being. So a museum being a place where these two things come together. And he explains in biblic epic texts why things are right or wrong. For instance, why some architects have done entrances in a diagonal way, which is, of course, the most stupid way you can come into a gallery, because it splits the space apart and destroys the space. And he explains it in a very interesting and very also almost somehow funny way. His most famous book is Die List der Unschuld, which is about a sculpture, puts the sculpture of Judd in the center of his observation. He talks literally about everything, why the gap is as it is, how the edge is, what the surface is, why it has 6 cubes and not 7 and not 5 or 4, etc. So it's very, very sharp. And of course, as I said, we've done buildings together. We have designed his own studio outside Basel, a very simple structure where somehow we introduced painting without painting it, really. That's also, again, a seemingly unimportant detail, but because everybody likes painting, but you don't want to do the movement yourself, so we use rain and the rust of the metal. And it opens to the outside, to this very strange garden that Remy built over the years, almost like a Max Ernstian landscape. And this studio is like also a little museum for his own work, which is not only, as I said, about text and about perception, but also uses color in a way that it makes looking difficult, or you have to make an extra effort to decipher what he's writing. All that I said now is, of course, was in total contrast to the current tendencies at that time in the 70s and early 80s, where the then heroes of architecture were doing museums, all the big museums that we would have so much loved to do, and which we found absolutely terrifying. Like the National Gallery in London, or Stuttgart Staatsgalerie, Sterling, then in Frankfurt by Hollein, all these museums which were more about style and traditional spaces and awkward things, which were more, let's say, art for themselves than doing spaces for art, spacing that artists would like. And artists, I tell you the truth, at that time they really hated all these buildings. And they hated them because they were not made for them. They were made by the architects who celebrated themselves. When we first could do our first building for art, the Goetz collection, we took this as a statement for different things. It was perhaps the first time that an architect could do a minimalist structure, and we called it also minimal, because it was reducing architectural elements, and it was avoiding any analogy to a building, any figuration. It was trying to use clear structure, this upper floor put on top of these 2 tunnels, but at the same time introducing sanded glass and birch plywood. We took 2 totally different materials and make them look as similar as possible, so the whole thing would look as one thing, almost. And we, of course, also made associations between birch, plywood, and real birches outside. Things that you don't need to see, but that you can feel or you can understand if you're there, because it somehow makes the garden be part of the building and vice versa. We also couldn't go so high as we wanted. That's why we had to bury part of the building, but we're making sure that the lower floor and the upper floor were having the same importance, which means they have the same light condition. So the light band on the top, which is a skylight, is also a skylight here. But if you look from outside, you don't see this as a skylight, but like a facade, but in fact has the same function. So the result is, once you're in the building, you have the exact same spatial experience. And because this is a small building, the intention to make the visitor feel lost or feel surrounded by the same space, and not to make a space on top more important than below, was a very important discovery, and was also later very important when we did Tate Modern, in that we dug out the turbine hall, especially also so that every floor was starting from that ground, and you wouldn't need to go underground in a basement, which would give you automatically, or the artist that exposes there, a feeling of being less important. The light coming in and the kind of space were new at that time, and artists liked it. We were collaborating with Helmut Fedele, an artist friend then, and so we were making sure that this was a space made for the artists of that time. And this building was also very important. Nick Zerota saw this building, and he loved that building, and was a decisive factor why we were commissioned Tate Modern. It's radically simple, but complex, nevertheless, in the spatial effect. That's the stair connecting the two floors. And at night, you can see that what seemed very close together, at night, disassembles much more. So this piece, sitting on top of two other pieces, becomes more evident. So it's also about ambivalence. From this very early museum, I jump to the almost last one we've done, the last one, in fact, that we have opened. I hate this word, Paris Art Museum. It's the Art Museum in Miami, which is not dissimilar to M+, is on that side, that's pre-construction, on a landfill kind of a place, and a kind of a place that before did not exist and was not really integrated part of the city. And it's also part of the whole development, the cultural development. As you may know, this is Miami Beach. This is Lincoln Road, where we have done the garage build. No, that's Lincoln Road here, that we have discussed before, and that I don't present today. So we have been able to do two buildings that we consider major buildings in our collection. Like Hong Kong, Miami was not really an art place. It was more a fun place, hedonistic place, also very pleasant, very good weather. But Art Basel has moved there and transformed the city, literally. I mean, it always has had great collectors, but it hasn't really had institutions. And the Paris Museum has become such an institution which now, 1 year since its opening, has attracted many more people than it was planned, and hopefully attracts also private collections, enabled to grow as an institution. You see this picture also, that's where the museum now stands, and this kind of a no man's land has now increasingly become a public park, and a place where, you know, not only we reclaimed land, but also floods are an issue. And you can see other projects in that area, other museums. And also the inspiration, not that this is the reference, but it says that building on stilts, or responding to the ground. We were seeing the excavation in Tate, we were seeing the excavation in M+, but the relationship of a building to the ground is fundamental to a building, that the way it stands on the ground is at the beginning of, like, the identity of what that building is. And you can see how the building integrates. It wants to be totally low-rise, it wants to be close to the water, it wants to be on stilts, it wants to be shading people and plants, it wants nothing to do with all that stuff here. It's also how you cope with the city, you know, being different or associating yourself. You know that in M+, we have a different approach. We also have no chance against the huge new towers. But as a museum, as a building, you have to have a clear standpoint in what you want to be, kind of a building, comparing with others. You're not in a classical city anymore where the buildings had more or less the same scale and where the museum just had different colonnades. But the role or the challenge for the architect and the planners has stayed the same. You can see one important feature that was very important to us is this is a city where the weather is nice. This is a city where you have vegetation. So we use that. Previous museums have had black glass and the door, you were in or out. No place to sit, no vegetation, nothing. You were in or out and you were in an air-conditioned box. And we want to avoid this kind of inhuman way to deal with architecture. Architecture offers you all these kind of things. This canopy, this trellis canopy made the stay in the museum and around the museum really different from any other museum, different from any other even restaurant or other public place in Miami. So we use stilts to lift the building from the ground. This is for the garage. So the first floor is on the ground and it's part of the whole thing. It's not detached. It's an integral part of the whole. Then we use plans, not only outside to look at, but literally to invade the building. We make it come down from the canopy. So as a visitor, when you come from outside, where often it's humid and hot, comparable to Hong Kong, we want this buffer to play a role as a transition between outside and inside. So it's not just a decoration, it's a physical ingredient of the building. This will grow over the time and will literally invade and become bigger. And if a storm is coming, it will blow it away, but it will grow again. We have talked about that. That was, of course, an issue. You have typhoons in Miami. You have this big stair, which is almost making people perform using the outside. We want this is the turbine hall, so to speak, of the Miami Museum. The building has become a place where you go and meet, even if you don't visit the shows. And again, like at the Tate, I insist on the construction, on how these plans are put in place, how these hanging plants really work, get water, are hanging together, deal with wind, etc., etc. If you want to do surprising things, you have to construct them. You have to be very serious, otherwise you will be blamed being just a decorator or a bluffer. We mock up things. We try materials out. America is not a place with great construction. They don't know how to use concrete. So you have to teach. You have to tell them how to do this. Exposed concrete, exposed wood, no lacquer, no treatment in a country where liability is the most important thing was quite a tough thing to do. But now everybody loves it. But we had to test it. We have to test that some change over time, some transformation of material, some weathering is normal and is good, is making it better. Whereas if everything needs to be shiny and controlled, then you can forget it. But if you can make this weathering or this aging in a controlled way, it can become beautiful. You have many, many ways of surface treatment, to make concrete rougher as opposed to this kind of very generic concrete surfaces. That continues to play a role because some of the concrete was prefabricated, some were locally cast concrete, and it comes together, has to come together purposefully and not coincidentally. It has to be planned. It has to be ideally play a role in how you touch it, how you see it, how you pass by it. also how to stiffen the columns, so they can be as thin as possible, they don't break. How the trellis and the plants and these vertical columns come together, how they are horizontally connecting. How the galleries, how this vegetation is invading even the interior part of the museum, especially if the museum, like here, has very nice galleries, but it doesn't yet have very good exhibitions and collections. We design furniture for the place. We want the place to be comfortable, to be pleasant, to be inviting, and to have views. This museum is in Miami, and M+ will be in Hong Kong, and the Tate is in London, and Goetz is in Munich. Architecture is about the place, and makes a place. The view out of the window is not just a window here, but it's a full cut in the wall. So the wall on both sides has an integral function. I also show this museum because of the layout that you see here, because it's like an example of how Rémy Zaugg would have done a museum, which is making each gallery or group of galleries almost like an independent building from where you go out and then you're in an in-between space and you go in the next group of galleries. In this case, this concept was used because of two reasons. We wanted it to be controlled in a way that it's like stones that are grouped together, also for climatic reason, and using exposed concrete, even sometimes inside the galleries, so that curators and galleries surfaces would have different wall surfaces, but also because, as I said before, the museum does not yet have a great collection, and the plan was to have focus in these boxes or in these anchor rooms. We developed this word anchor room, so that eventually you could have just a collection of one artist to make this like a heavy point, like a point of gravity inside the whole. And in between, the flowing space would be more overview. So the overview could be more based on documents and reproductions and not just on original work. So you would really use this to structure from where you go and not just hang anything anywhere. So this museum, the way it's built up, is deeply rooted in the conditions, the historic conditions of that museum. And also we wanted the flow through the museum to be a flow that is to do with the climate, with the vegetation, as I said, and with the views to the ocean and to the city. We wanted the building to be permeable and the theater, the performing space, to be in a central position, which is not hidden away, but is being used as a big ceremonial stair. This is, again, one of the galleries. The theater as a big ceremonial stair that leads people from the ground floor up through the whole building, so that you would walk through it and use it in moments where there is no performance or no lecture or no theater play or whatever. So to integrate everything, to make everything visible and expose everything. That's also a very important part, as you may know, in M+, the performing art part has a key role. We will see that later. That's a section which shows how this works, so that it's not only a theater, but it's also a grand stair that people walk through, whereas others use it as a place to stay and read. So it can switch functions by means of large curtains that help transform the space or turn it into an upper part and a lower part. We zoom out again, reach the lowest floor. As I said, it's quite a nice garage. So we are obsessed with nice places for cars. And the stair at night, where it also works very well. Now we come to Hem Plus, and you may know the building, you may know the project, you may have seen plans, etc. But I think it's important to maybe summarize again a few of the ideas that made the project look the way it does now, and why perhaps the jury has made the decision for Herzog de Meuron. It's in a new place in West Kowloon, kind of a refill. So it's a place which didn't exist before, which has no ground, so to speak. So again, this idea of where to put it, how to make it a credible place, to make it stand up next to these big towers here. What should the building be? Just one kind of object was not what we could have done. We needed to find components or ingredients to make it credible and to make it a place only for there. So we tried to turn seemingly opposing forces into assets. This obsession with towers and lights in Hong Kong, how can you compete with this? There's no way. This is so beautiful and powerful at the same time. So we said, we should also have a tower. And we especially towers and we should also have a screen. We should also make it into a screen. Because we want to give the artists the possibility to inscribe their message in that silhouette and not stand away. And for those who look carefully, again, we are in that moment where we talk about looking, perceiving. If you look carefully, you can decipher the message of the artist as opposed to the commercial message of advertisement. And we like towers, we like Hong Kong towers, because Hong Kong has ugly and beautiful towers, but especially the towers, not those so much, but those you only find in Hong Kong, because they are like vertical villages, because they are not owned by or used by one big company, but is like the expression of individuality and individual functions, and is mesmerizing. The fact that you have artist studios somewhere here or wherever, that you have any kind of function, you don't just have living space, not just working space, you have so many different people and different things together, make it a real Hong Kong feature. And that's why we thought we have to make M+ is not a museum like the Tate, is a place for visual culture. So it has many other talents and many other people. So the liveliness and the multifunctional side, and also the roughness that you see here, this is not done by an architect with this idea, but somehow the building, many buildings at least have this potential to be also misused or to be interpreted in a different way, to be open structures. Another thing that we liked was the fact that this is having no character, no history, was difficult, especially because the brief said the museum, like all other museums, now wants industrial spaces, rough spaces, lab spaces, spaces where you can do the unexpected and experimental. To do this in such an innocent and virgin place is difficult. You would have to invent it. But then we found this tunnel which was cutting through the site, and what seemed to be a hurdle or a hindering factor, we turned it into an asset, because we said, gladly it has this tunnel, because then we can dig it out and we can build over, but at least we have some archaeology. We have history in that site, And because also it's so awkwardly diagonal, it's really disturbing. It's really like a force, an energy that is through Hong Kong, because it's connecting the airport with the city. So it's real, and whether you want it or not, it has to do with this place only. So that was a decisive moment, I think, in our finding an approach. The tower we speak about, the underground we speak about. This is where the building is rooted, and digging out that tunnel helped us to do a kind of found space, in that we would pour concrete over it, and in a kind of a negative form next to it, we would allocate this kind of found space, this kind of industrial space, this kind of huge underground world, which offers totally different conditions than in the upper part, in this horizontal slab, the vertical slab, the horizontal slab, with the podium, where all the more classical galleries, as diverse as they may be, will be integrated. And then, of course, you have above the found space, you have, which is a ground floor in that it's opening to the park level. You have the ground floor, which is opening to the backside. You have this kind of ground where people come in and have an overview over the institution. That's the lower floor that's opening to the park, where you come in and you almost fall in this huge opening that is really cutting into the ground and revealing what we found there. And these big spaces are opening up possibilities for artists and curators equally. You can see the tunnel that I spoke about that is helping shape this underground space. We like this image because it shows the result of this kind of underground world, which is this roughness that we give to the whole building. The building is building on top of this ground. It's a serious structural world that literally grows out and informs the rest of the building. It's juxtaposed with softer materials. You will see that the museum deals with these contrasts of concrete, of ceramics, of wood, of glass, and never forgets the fact that it needs to be flexible, it needs to be robust, it needs to live for generations and different artists with different intentions and wishes. On that ground floor where you come in, you have different places, like here where you have the theater spaces, you have the, what's the official name? You can see these two places are deeply inspired by the theaters and the auditoriums, which introduce this kind of stepping and this kind of other spaces, as opposed to the Kunsthalle space here, which is the reconfigurable space. When you come into the main hall, you have a first possibility to jump into a gallery. That's also something we absolutely wanted to do, that when you go into the building, you don't feel like in an airport, but you have an immediate encounter with art, whether it's you go into the show or whether you have a look down into the underground space. And then you have these learning spaces where also for performance, for film, in this side, for film screening, you introduce what we saw before also in Miami, and also what the Tate will offer to itself in the second phase, in the tank area, where you introduce performance and audience and auditorium-like spaces, which can be interpreted or used in many different forms. You know, we spoke about performance as a key force also. We mentioned Joseph Beuys, but in fact we could also do buildings for performing arts, namely the Laban in London, which is in kind of a dance school, so this is only for that purpose. But we try to, in that building also, to use those spaces which are about performance in the overall concept for the building. So not exclusively performance in secluded spaces, but try to inspire the rest of the building, like also the color of these spaces that would spill out and transform the character of the whole building. We will not have that in the same way in M+, because it's a more integrated, it's more like a topography as opposed to the Laban. But we will certainly feel, you go into the building, that this will be a major force, a major element, maybe more than in any other previous museum that we've done, this kind of moment of the performance. Even in these found spaces, we hope that performance will play a role and not just static art or drop sculptures as mostly we can see in traditional museums. On this image, what I think is very important is that from that found underground, you see the structures that go up, that here open this cut through the podium, and these strong pillars lift up the building or the force, or bring down the forces from the slab into the ground, where again you have this intersection of one geometry with the found geometry of the tunnel. I think this is a key thing, and we worked quite a bit on the coming together of these different forces and how to expose it, and to expose literally the strong energy, structural energy, and at the same time introducing wood and especially tiles, ceramic tiles, to make it softer, more pleasant, also more shiny, more changing in its surface, and to make it more a place for Hong Kong. We believe that introducing these tiles, these kind of ceramic surfaces that we develop and we need to test and mock up, as in previous projects, will be a key factor for the success of the finished building. As in Miami, we have a stair which is on the back of this auditorium on the learning center. We will walk up and at the same time be able to sit. With this feature, we hope to attract people to use that way to go directly up onto the podium, where you will find a garden, you will find a cafe, maybe there is an exhibition, sculpture exhibition, or there is an event. So this connection between the garden level and the ground level to the roof of the podium is an important element to animate the building, to make the building publicly accessible, so that people, we want people, I mean, this is a very lively city, we want this huge building to be animated and to offer places, like I mentioned this notion of topography, that's why we wanted to sit on the back, literally, of this triangular shape roof. That's again this kind of way up through this courtyard onto the top of the podium. And you can also see how the structure of the slab, the central slab, is growing out of this underground. Again, this same stair under this gallery for prints leads you up onto the roof of the podium. That's the interior courtyard of the podium with a view down in the ground floor, entrance floor. That's around this central light. This is where the tower grows out, and around you have galleries in 4 quadrants. Again, the same space. And in one of these gallery suites, one of the spaces that is like offering views onto the park around the museum through these ceramic-clad pillars, vertical structures. One of the galleries, the Skylight Gallery, we have galleries with skylight, like here, especially this main large hall. We have galleries with only side light, we have gallery only with artificial light, we have different floor treatments. Maybe we have also stone. We will try different things to create or introduce diversity in this big museum. Again, another ceiling, remindful of what we tested for the first time in the Walker. And this model, I think, is interesting because it shows, again, now talking construction, how these elements are put together. So they are credible and they make sense, that we detach this slab from the rest, so you can see that these forces shoot up or bring you down on the ground, that this slab is deconnected from the rest and remains a slab and speaks this language of a slab, and is not just some kind of canopy. And the same is true for this big podium. And you can see all these things in that section, where some of these forces go down the ground, avoid this underground structure, and are detached from, also laterally from the two sides, and is also detached here, and not amalgamized, as that was a long discussion we had among ourselves. And a lot of thinking was necessary to understand that these are actually like put together, and the joints of how elements come together in architecture are key places where you understand the different elements and you give them a clear identity. This slab, the podium, the vertical slab, this kind of transparency, this kind of ceramic tiles that run around the whole slab and are containing this kind of electronic devices which make it possible to bring information, artistic information or any kind of information onto the screen facing the city. Again, the stair that brings people up to the rooftop of the podium, and some windows on the way through the galleries that offer these views out through, again, the ceramic tile clad facade. This is the stair. That's the tower, which ideally is not but used just for offices, but offers some places for artists to go or some installation to happen, and also for people to go up to the top. So it's not like in America where you have the museum in the lower part and then you have a developer-style tower for offices or for rich apartments. The main entrance the garden side facing the water, and again that side. And of course, coming back to this issue of how to cope with huge neighbors, you can't. But this screen and this width of the screen, especially when lit at night, will be a very powerful answer, and a very powerful, though very small, related to this, but so different from the rest that it will stand out in the skyline and make Hong Kong a much more interesting art place. This is the last image, and this means finished for today.
To show our appreciation, may I invite Professor Chen to present a souvenir to Professor Herzog. Please remain on stage. Professor Chen would also like to present a souvenir to Professor de Meuron. May I also invite the Dean of Faculty of Social Science, Professor Chu Chi-Yu, to come join in for the photo. May I also invite the sponsor of Kinoshita Lecture, Mr. and Mrs. James Kinoshita, to join in for the photo. join me in giving another round of applause to Professor Herzog for sharing his insights with us.